This is 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for checking us out today. It's time for the national edition of the Friday News Roundup. And I don't know about you, but this weekend could not come soon enough. Some folks are starting to lose patience, like Fox News anchor Shepard Smith.
It's crazy what we're watching every day. He keeps repeating ridiculous throwaway lines that are not true at all and sort of avoiding this issue of Russia as if we're some kind of fools for asking the question. Really? Your opposition was hacked and the Russians were responsible for it and your people were on the phone with Russia on the same day it was happening and we're fools for asking the questions? No, sir. We are not fools for asking this question, and we demand to know the answer to this question. We have a right to know.
That was Shep's reaction to the freewheeling, rather caustic news conference President Trump gave yesterday. But a lot more happened this week besides the usual sparring with the press. Joining us to take the gloves off and make sense of some of the national headlines from this week is Byron York, chief political correspondent for the Washington Examiner. Byron, welcome to 1A.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Ruth Marcus is a columnist and the deputy editorial page editor for the Washington Post. Hi, Ruth.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And Reed Wilson is national correspondent for The Hill. Reed, glad to have you with us.
Hey, Joshua.
In this hour, we'll talk politics, we'll talk immigration, and we'll throw in a few of your suggestions for non-political stories worth noting. Feel free to send us your questions and thoughts on this week's top national news. Email us 1a@wamu.org, comment on our Facebook page, tweet us at 1a, and you can watch the live video stream of this hour online at the1a.org. That's the word the number 1, the letter a.org. Let's begin with Michael Flynn. The president's national security advisor resigned this week after it was revealed that he had been in contact with Russian operatives during the presidential campaign and misled Vice President Pence about this. I wonder what we think the next steps are in this. Reed Wilson, where do we go from here?
Well, now President Trump is looking for a new national security advisor, and the questions about Mike Flynn are not going away anytime soon. We've seen Republicans on Capitol Hill begin to suggest that there ought to be some kind of investigation into him. A number of different suggestions coming out of, say, Senator John McCain, Congressman Jason Chaffetz, who heads the House Government Oversight and Reform Committee, Oversight and Government Reform Committee. There are a lot of timeline questions here that were raised by President Trump during his press conference yesterday. Usually these are stories that the White House tries to put behind them, but President Trump essentially said yesterday that he had questions about General Flynn's, Admiral Flynn's comments to Mike Pence, the vice president, as early as January 26th. And here we are in the middle of February. One wonders why we've gone 4 weeks in an administration without a national security advisor that the president says he can trust.
Yeah, Ruth Marcus, what would be the process or the likelihood behind an investigation for General Flynn? I think I just said Admiral too. It's General. Sorry about that.
I'm sorry. My
what would be the process behind that, the politics? How likely does that look to you?
Well, there are kind of two prongs of investigatory looks at General Flynn. You guys had me a little rattled with the Admiral. I was
sorry about that.
Myself.
Sorry.
One is the continuing question reported in the Washington Post today about whether he was honest, not only with Vice President Pence, that can get you fired from the White House, but whether he was honest with the FBI in the interview they did with him about the nature of his conversations with Ambassador Kislyak about the sanctions.
The Russian ambassador to the U.S.
The Russian ambassador to the U.S. The FBI interviewed him. He apparently said, well, we didn't discuss sanctions. We get into this kind of Clintonian discussion about what is the meaning of sanctions. My gut is that will not end up in a prosecution. But then again, if I were General Flynn, I'd be hiring a lawyer if I didn't already have one. Then there is the question of how the Hill or independent investigation works. There's clearly not, among some key Hill Republicans, a huge appetite to do this. With that problem is taken care of itself was one thing that we heard, or why would Republicans spend time investigating Republicans? I think those statements are no longer tenable. There is going to be an investigation. The question really is whether it's going to be done, as it seems right now, in the Senate Intelligence Committee, or whether it's going to be a broader, more kind of 9/11 outside bipartisan commission, or both, which some have suggested.
Yeah, Byron York, what about the possibility of a special prosecutor? The New York Times editorial board opined in favor of that today. Is that even a feasible possibility?
No, I don't think it is. I think there's a couple of things to remember with the Flynn case specifically. So many of these cases in Washington end up being process crimes issues. Did somebody tell the truth to investigators about? Now, there is an underlying event here, which was allegedly talking to the Russian ambassador and discussing sanctions with him. And the question of whether there's even anything wrong with that. And I personally don't think there is. And I'm going to read you just a little bit from what Stephen Hadley, who was National Security Advisor for George W. Bush, respected establishment guy,
Please.
asked about it. And he said he was asked about this, talking about sanctions. He said, I don't see what would be wrong if he, Mike Flynn, simply said to the Russians, look, don't retaliate. Doesn't make sense. Hurts my country. Makes it harder for us as an incoming administration to reconsider Russia policy, which is something we said we'd do. So just hold your fire and let us have a shot at this. Now, this is something Stephen Hadley thought would be okay for an incoming national security advisor to discuss with a foreign official. So I think when we look at the underlying issue here, we have to ask, is there really any problem there?
And I guess the question is, what exactly did he say, and under what circumstances, and when, and how was that received? Ruth?
Yeah, and quickly on the question of special prosecutor, there are a couple different issues here. I highly doubt that there will be a special prosecutor, particularly when it comes to General Flynn. But there's another sort of parallel intertwined investigation going on here, which has to do with the apparent contacts that people in or associated with the Trump campaign had with Russian officials at the same time that intelligence agencies tell us pretty conclusively that Russia was trying to influence the election on President Trump's behalf. The question is whether a Justice Department run by an investigation ultimately supervised by Attorney General Jeff Sessions can do that fairly. If you look at the Justice Department's own guidelines for when you should recuse yourself from from supervising an investigation, they talk about whether you had close political connections with the person being investigated. It seems very clear to me that it would be wise for the Attorney General to recuse himself from this. That doesn't require a special prosecutor, but it would leave it to more career justice officials and the Deputy Attorney General.
Reed?
And consider where we are in the administration. We're talking about multiple investigations into the President of the United States by Congress, by the FBI, and by other elements of the intelligence agency. At this point in the Bush administration, we were talking about tax cuts, and was No Child Left Behind up this early?
It was on its way, yeah.
It was coming pretty soon. At this point in the Obama administration, we were talking about the stimulus. This is not the right foot for a new administration to get off on, regardless of whether or not anything comes from this. We already have members of the president's own party talking about multiple investigations into the administration.
That's Reed Wilson, national correspondent for The Hill, with us for the national edition of the Friday News Roundup, alongside Ruth Marcus of The Washington Post, Byron York of The Washington Examiner, and you. What questions and thoughts do you have about the week's top national stories? Tweet us at 1A, comment on our Facebook page, or email us 1A@WAMU.org. I understand a lot of our listeners want to talk about yesterday's press conference. I admit I have, I know.
Told you.
I know. And we've been trying to avoid it because it was just such a circus. It was just so rambunctious and rude, and it was just all over the place. And so I tend to want to hedge away from it because there is actual news that was committed this week that we have to discuss. But what were your takeaways from the press conference? Was it all heat, or was there any light? Byron?
Well, I mean, aside from the theater reviews, and there's been a lot of that, I mean, there was a lot
That's
of news.
That's a good analogy,
the
theater
president,
reviews for sure.
Look, the president gave the best telling that we've had from the horse's mouth of the firing of Mike Flynn, which we were just talking about, why he did it, when he thought what he thought. He addressed the whole Russia connection thing, said that he didn't know of anybody on his campaign having connections, but on the other hand, everybody knew that his campaign chairman at the time, Paul Manafort, did a lot of business in that part of the world. He said he would file a new executive order replacing the current executive order that's the subject of so much litigation, temporarily suspending immigration from 7 countries. So he actually, in this 75 minutes of performance, there was a fair amount of actual news.
And he spoke very, very emotionally, seemingly from the heart, about the difficulty that he was encountering in how to deal with the DACA order, that is, the Dreamer kids who were brought here at a young age, grew up sort of understanding themselves, feeling themselves to be Americans. President Obama issued an order giving them some relief from being deported and ability to go to school and work here. Candidate Trump suggested everybody would be subject to deportation. President Trump is discovering this is a lot harder and more difficult to implement than he once thought.
We have seen this sort of what comes out of this president is a lot of short-term theater. I think Byron makes a good analogy there. Improv almost. But the actual longer-term implication that came out of this week and press conferences was not yesterday. It was during the press conference with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in which the president essentially got rid of the American commitment to a two-state solution, seemingly off the cuff. At the same time, his ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said, no, the United States still supports a two-state solution. That, in this sort of craziness of a long press conference yesterday, got totally overlooked.
We'll continue our conversation on the other side of this break with Byron York of the Washington Examiner, Ruth Marcus of the Washington Post, and Reed Wilson of The Hill. I'm Joshua Johnson. Glad to be with you. You're listening to 1A from WAMU and NPR.
From NPR member stations. And from Avalara, tax automation for businesses of all sizes. Avalara works to simplify sales tax and other business taxes with real-time rates and automatic filing at avalara.com, avalara.com. And from Inada, creators of the Japanese-made Dreamwave massage chair with shiatsu point detection and 16 programmed massages, including morning and nighttime sessions. Retail dealers nationwide. More at dreamwavechair.com.
This is 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson. It's the Friday News Roundup with Byron York of the Washington Examiner, Ruth Marcus of the Washington Post, and Reed Wilson of The Hill. Please keep sending in your questions and thoughts about the week's top national stories. Email us 1a@wamu.org, tweet us at 1a, or comment on our Facebook page. Let's talk about the cabinet. Steve Mnuchin, who's a former Goldman Sachs banker, was confirmed as Treasury Secretary on Monday by the Senate Finance Committee. We did an hour on Steve Mnuchin earlier this week that you can hear on our website, the1a.org. What are some of the first things we can expect to see from him in that role? Where might he start, or what has he signaled thus far that his priorities are?
Well, he's talked about tax reform. That is clearly the area where the Hill is raring to go. It's very, very complicated. He said something interesting right about the time during the transition that he was nominated, that despite candidate Trump had any number of different tax reform proposals, he said that wealthy Americans would not be getting a net tax cut because they would take away enough deductions to make that even. It would be middle-class Americans who would get the tax cut. I would really like to see that on paper because it's actually not mathematically possible from my assessment. So he's going to have a really complicated set of work to do with the Hill to work on tax reform and to do it in a way that's consistent with what the president has said.
The Senate is also set to vote on EPA Administrator nominee Scott Pruitt today. He was the Attorney General of Oklahoma. He's expected to get confirmed by many accounts, despite Senate Democrats putting up a particularly hard fight against his nomination. Talk us through some of what the issues were with Scott Pruitt.
Right. Actually, Josh, the first time I was on your show, we had Coral Davenport from the New York Times here, and she made an excellent point that amid all of the nominations that the Democrats have gotten most angry about, Pruitt is the one who offers the most sort of ideological challenge to the administration that he would run, the Environmental Protection Agency. Pruitt has sued the EPA. He knows the agency in and out. He is probably the most qualified to run the particular agency for which he has been chosen because he knows it so well, because he's been suing it so often. His nomination has been delayed by Democrats for whom environmental issues are front and center. They worry that his ties to oil companies and energy-producing companies at large are going to pose a problem for what they would hope the EPA would do. And so now his nomination has been delayed into next week. There are a few Republicans who have voiced some concern. Senator Susan Collins from Maine says she'll vote against him. Senator John McCain, last time I saw, said he wasn't going to vote on that nomination, which is not necessarily opposition. But then again, Pruitt's going to get some Democratic support. Joe Manchin, specifically from West Virginia, a state that relies heavily on the coal industry for its economic well-being, is going to vote in favor of him. And I can imagine that there will be a few other sort of energy state and red state Democrats, maybe Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota, maybe Joe Donnelly from Indiana, who will vote for him. So there's a little bit of cross-partisan, sort of across the aisle support and opposition to him, but he is going to be one of the more influential members of Donald Trump's cabinet.
And there's something really interesting, I think, when he gets into office, because he is going to get confirmed, what he faces then. I mean, now top Environmental Protection Agency officials are kind of lobbying against him. They're expressing open opposition to him. And there was a story in the New York Times that said, because civil service rules make it difficult to fire federal workers, the show of defiance indicates Mr. Pruitt will face strong internal opposition to many of his promised efforts. So it's going to be a battle every single day inside the EPA bureaucracy.
I get the sense, though, and there was an interview on Morning Edition today from a number of Republican lawmakers, that Scott Pruitt might be just what the doctor ordered in terms of the EPA if you believe, as many Republicans and conservatives do, that the EPA has overstepped its legal authority, that it's responsible for leaving environmental protection to the states first and then stepping in if the states don't act. So depending on your point of view, Scott Pruitt could be just the right antidote to government overreach.
Well, that's why he's going to get almost unanimous Republican support. I mean, you go to Iowa and there are farmers who say, the EPA is making me declare a puddle on my farm to be wetlands. I mean, they feel that they've been overregulated in this sense. So he's going to have a lot of Republican support doing that.
And by the way, one of the early successes of the Trump administration, one of the first measures that he actually signed was a measure to overturn a stream protection rule that the Obama administration EPA sort of tried to promulgate at the end of their term. So there is some effort from the White House already, and some successful effort to roll back some of what the Obama administration had done.
Congress
The
actually did
rollback
that, right?
effort is going to be...
Congress did it, but Trump signed it.
The rollback effort is going to be really interesting. Congress has some authority. It's been rarely used, but will be used more to roll back last-minute regulations, not just from EPA, but from other agencies. But in terms of rolling back existing regulations, Scott Pruitt and others are going to face not just resistance from within the civil service bureaucracy, but the kind of very complicated regulatory regime that exists, which is you have to go through a very cumbersome process to undo a regulation, and you have to prove the need essentially to undo it. And you're subject to being sued over that. So we're not going to see a lot of vigorous enforcement, but it's also going to be harder than I think they think to undo some of the existing rules.
Another one of the cabinet nominees that made news this week was Andrew Puzder. He withdrew his from being nominated to be the next labor secretary after a tape of his ex-wife from an episode of the Oprah Winfrey Show surfaced. His ex-wife appeared in disguise and claimed that Mr. Puzder abused her in their marriage. She had later gone on to recant those statements. Pretty unusual to see a nomination like this not get through for such a salacious reason.
Well, I do think it's kind of a matter of discussion whether an ugly divorce from 3 decades ago should sink you. I think a bigger factor with this is that shortly before the Puzder withdrawal, National Review, conservative magazine, comes out against Puzder because as a fast food executive, basically he kind of loves unskilled, low-paid immigration. And this is something that National Review and other conservatives who want to restrict not just illegal immigration, but legal immigration somewhat, they're very, very opposed to. And the head of the Center for Immigration Studies said, surely Commerce Secretary is a job that they can find some other American willing to do. So I think that there was a lot of opposition to Puzder that went far beyond any of this Oprah divorce stuff.
I think one of the other interesting things about yesterday's news conference, for example, this 75-minute news conference, was I was hoping to hear more about Alexandra Acosta, who is the new nominee to be the labor secretary. Now, I remember Alex Acosta from when I was a reporter in South Florida, and he was the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida and put a lot of bad guys away. It's not hard to do in South Florida. And he also was the dean of the law school at Florida International University. This seems like somebody who basically has what it takes to be confirmed and to be one of maybe the less controversial picks.
Right, and it was notable that one of the first emails about him that hit my inbox was an endorsement from the International Association of Firefighters. There aren't a lot of unions that backed Andy Puzder. As a matter of fact, all of the unions had mobilized against him. So here is Donald Trump's second pick, and he's endorsed pretty quickly by a significant national union. That is something that Democrats are going to pay attention to. The Democratic unions sort of marshaled their opposition to Betsy DeVos, the education secretary, and made her a flashpoint. Puzder became a flashpoint, both, as Byron put it, for the immigration stuff and also for his reliance on low-paid workers and
his failure to pay taxes
right.
on one of his own workers.
Yeah.
There was a lot of different strands there.
Yeah. So the unions have been the most successful way in which Democrats have mobilized opposition to Trump's potential picks, and now he just picked somebody that they actually like. So there's something that does hint, as you suggest, that he could win confirmation pretty easily.
And one last thing about this, and I was saying this before the Puzder problem, it would have been unusual if Trump had gotten all of his cabinet picks confirmed. I mean, it hasn't been done, I think, since the late 1980s. So every president loses at least one in this scenario. Trump may lose more, I don't know, but losing one is entirely par for the course for a new president.
Let's get to a few comments from our audience. Ashton tweeted us, Mike Flynn messed up, but it seems more likely that he's a convenient scapegoat being sacrificed to keep the heat off POTUS and company. Is he a scapegoat?
I don't think the heat is coming off the president at all.
And we don't know yet, because one of the intriguing questions, and this is why one of the substantive things that came out of the news conference yesterday that we're going to inevitably talk about, no matter the host's resistance
no matter
to
what.
it, is that the president said, well, I would have directed him to discuss it if he hadn't raised it himself. And it remains unclear, and I believe there have been reports that, in fact, the president was aware shortly after, if not before the conversation, shortly after it, that they had discussed that, which re-raises the question of, sorry to say this, what did the president know and when did he know it, and how did he allow his vice president, if that is true, to be misled? How did he allow his press secretary to go out and state things that were not true? I know there are some people who are laughing as they're hearing this for so long. And so that was a very important statement by the president yesterday.
Was he? Other thoughts on whether he was a scapegoat?
Well, I'd say that this brings up a really interesting point about what Mike Pence's role is in the administration going forward. My gut feeling as he was nominated and became vice president was that he was going to be one of the more powerful vice presidents that we've had in recent times. He knows Washington. He has great relations with Republicans on Capitol Hill. He used to be a member of House Republican leadership, and he has a very strong connection to the traditional Republican base beyond the base that the president himself has. And I think this raises questions about his distance from the Trump inner circle. So as we look forward to the rest of the Trump administration, where is Mike Pence in this orbit? Is he going to play the role of just the sort of emissary to Capitol Hill, or is he going to play a much more substantive policy role? That question is a lot more in doubt now than I think it was a couple weeks ago.
I'm Joshua Johnson. You're listening to 1A. Byron, did you want to jump in?
Well, I think one thing about Pence, and it's unclear what his role is going to be, but when you look at Trump's career, I mean, he has made a lot of money, and it's very big business, but it's a really small circle. I mean, he's dealt with a tiny number of aides, some people in his family, and that's it. And that's the way he has run his business. And he doesn't have enough family and close circle to run the executive branch. And so he's going to have to pick people, Pence's obvious choice, to take a lot of responsibility and do things that the president, doesn't know about when they're doing them. So Trump is going to have to change the way he operates to run the executive branch.
Ruth?
Or not. But I think there's an open question now about whether this Flynn episode marginalizes the vice president or empowers him. Because, look, Flynn isn't there. Pence is. He's elected. He's not going away. And his apparent fury at this, I think, suggests that it's going to be very difficult for the administration if this episode were to recur in some way.
Let's shift to immigration for a moment. Yesterday, a nationwide protest in support of immigrants disrupted business as usual in many U.S. cities. Many restaurants closed. Workers went on strike to demonstrate the impact that immigrants have on the American economy. One protest took place in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Immigrants are welcome here, no hate, no fear. Immigrants are welcome here, no hate, no fear. Immigrants are welcome here, no hate, no fear.
What sense do we have of whether or not this strike was successful, whether it had an impact, whether Washington noticed?
I'm not aware of any impact that it had. And also there seemed to be a little conceptual confusion between immigrants and illegal immigrants. I don't know what their point was. The United States hands out 1 million green cards a year, every year. People who are given permanent legal residence in the United States, chance to be a citizen. And I'm just not sure what their point was.
Well, I don't mean to make light of this, but a couple of places downtown were closed, and I took notice, at least, that had happened. But I think the larger point here is that this is going to become a significant national flashpoint. We have already seen several states, Ruth alluded to this earlier, in terms of how states are starting to sue or will have the opportunity to sue over environmental regulations if the processes aren't particularly followed. States are already preparing to sue over immigration orders, as we saw with the executive order that the president implemented at the end of January. The state of Washington led a lawsuit among the 50-plus lawsuits that were ended up being filed. It was the state of Washington's suit that blocked the executive order already. States like California, Washington, Oregon, where Democrats hold control of all, at least the governorship, if not all levers of government, are going to do a lot to do what they can, at least, to protect their citizens, or to protect their residents, documented or undocumented. This is going to become a big deal. There are going to be a lot of lawsuits coming down the pike.
I should also note that this Day Without Immigrant strike comes in the wake of federal immigration raids that saw hundreds of people arrested by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement last week. As we speak, the Associated Press is reporting on a draft memo that it says it obtained that considers mobilizing up to 100,000 National Guardsmen to help round up unauthorized and undocumented immigrants. That's 100,000. This is according to a draft memo that the Associated Press is just now reporting on. I wonder if this is what we make of this shift in immigration policy. First of all, is it a shift? Is it that unusual? And then secondly, what does this mean going forward in terms of immigration policy?
So I think this is where the public attention is going to really be focused, not by yesterday's protest, however many places it shut down, but by these stories of mothers wrested from their children. Yesterday, there was a woman who had been claiming abuse by her, I think, domestic partner, and she was afraid of being arrested at her protective order hearing, or was detained at her protective order hearing. And so the immigration groups complained bitterly about President Obama as the deporter in chief. He deported record numbers of people. He concentrated, as all presidents have to, because the numbers are too great to do it otherwise, really, on people he said were criminals. But the Trump administration is broadening its definition of criminal to include way more people. It's way more willing to sweep up, if not innocent, certainly more sympathetic people in its raids, and that is going to be the thing that really, I think, galvanizes public attention.
Time to take one last break. We'll continue the national edition of the Friday News Roundup in a moment with Ruth Marcus of the Washington Post, Reed Wilson of The Hill, Byron York of the Washington Examiner, and with you. Send us your questions and comments about the week's news, 1a@wamu.org. Stay close. I'm Joshua Johnson. Next hour on 1A, the global edition of the Friday News Roundup. Russia is staying busy after the U.S. National Security Advisor resigned. In Paris, riots have broken out in response to claims of police brutality. And who killed the brother of North Korea's leader? That's next hour on 1A's Friday News Roundup.
NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Constant Contact, committed to helping small businesses and nonprofits succeed with email marketing, working to help organizations meet their goals through personalized marketing help via phone, seminars, and webinars. More at constantcontact.com. From Home Instead Senior Care, with a range of in-home senior care services to keep senior loved ones at home, providing help with bathing, medication reminders, and Alzheimer's and dementia care. At homeinstead.com/NPR. And from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Before we dive back in, a quick reminder that we are still collecting your stories and suggestions for future shows. Email us 1a@wamu.org. And we really do appreciate these suggestions, including the one that many of you sent in telling us not to go digging for good news and to just stick to politics. Okay, fair enough. Point taken. Then again, plenty of you do like a change of pace to something a little more positive. Joshua Monroe on Twitter pointed us in the direction of the late founder of Little Caesars, the pizza chain. This week we learned that Mike Ilitch quietly helped out civil rights legend Rosa Parks. He apparently paid the rent on Parks' downtown Detroit apartment for more than a decade. Mike Ilitch passed away last week at age 87. So, whatever you think, keep the feedback coming. 1a@wamu.org. You can also call us with your feedback anytime, 855-236-1A1A. That's 855-236-1212. Back now to the Friday News Roundup with Reed Wilson of The Hill, Ruth Marcus of The Washington Post, and Byron York of The Washington Examiner. Byron, there was a point you wanted to squeeze in before we went to a break.
Yeah, on immigration, Trump's most important action on immigration so far has been an executive order he issued very early in his presidency. We sometimes see the Muslim-majority country executive order referred to as the immigration executive order, but earlier he had done a separate one, which basically ended the practice of catch and release for our border patrol forces, ordered the Justice Department and other departments to put pressure on sanctuary cities, and did a number of other things that will really probably likely have a real effect in the enforcement of our immigration laws and probably result in less litigation than some of the other things he's done.
One of our listeners wrote on our website, "There is no value or upside for Americans to waste an inordinate amount of tax dollars on deportation of people who merely violate immigration laws, a civil offense, not a criminal one." Is that part of the conversation in Washington, just whether or not it's even worth it to do this?
I think that's part of the broader policy conversation among experts who are trying to figure out ways to control and manage immigration. I mean, as Byron pointed out, we allow 1 million people a year or more to immigrate to the U.S., and frankly, we need them. I remember a few years ago when there was a bumper crop of apples in Washington State, and something like 40% of the crop rotted on the tree because there weren't enough workers to actually pick the apples. That's a part of the conversation in policy circles. It's not a part of the political conversation whatsoever. This has become one of the more heated political debates of our time. Not only between the two parties, but even within the Republican Party. I'll leave it there.
Speaking of policy debates that have gotten heated, let's talk about the Affordable Care Act. A number of Republican lawmakers got very strong pushback during some incredibly raucous town hall meetings just over a week ago. The future of the Affordable Care Act was high on the agenda. What kind of impact do these kind of protests have on members of Congress? We talked about the immigration protest, which may or may not have had a clear impact, but town halls facing a lawmaker, that's a little bit harder to deny, isn't it?
Well, not necessarily. You saw some lawmakers who insisted that these were fake paid protesters and not real protesters. Now, I don't know, maybe some of them came in from other states, but there is clearly a line. You know that it clearly exists because you see Republican lawmakers on the Hill responding to it. Clearly a lot of worry about the implications of repealing Obamacare without another safety net or other ways to obtain health coverage of similar value and reliability. in place. And I have to say, the Republican angst about these town halls is rather ironic, because if you think back to the Democratic lawmakers who were assailed by their constituents in town halls, and some of them complained at the time that it was all ginned up, but they also had some angst about it, complaining about Obamacare years ago. Now you see the reverse.
Right. And I don't know whether or not any of those were ginned up, but I covered some of those in South Florida, and they were
Intense.
hot. Oh my goodness gracious! It got hot to the point of being like, I remember at one point Palm Beach County Sheriff's deputies had to stand between Tea Party protesters and more progressive protesters to prevent them from coming to blows. And it was they just stood there silently and formed a ring around this woman who was so shaken up she started crying. Like, it was that scary, and they just had to. It was frightening.
And those who say that these are ginned up and made up protests, I would point them to what happened in 2010 after the protests against Democrats, when Republicans swept to a majority in the United States House of Representatives. So these can be leading edge indicators that there is a sustainable political movement and sustainable political anger at one particular party, which is why Republicans are actually more nervous about this. Is not because that these are fake, George Soros funded protests, but because there is political anger on the other side, and midterm elections are hard.
Byron?
Yeah, it's something Republicans really should pay attention to. Dismissing it as outside agitators is kind of stupid, but it does show you the degree of intensity on one side. And that's the thing it shows, because the public is still pretty divided on Obamacare. I would urge people to go. I'm looking at it right now. The Kaiser Foundation has done tracking polling on Obamacare from the very, very beginning. And if you look at it, it's just kind of evenly divided the whole time. In December, 46 against, 43 for. So basically the other side of that equation started showing up at the town hall rallies, and that tells a politician where the intensity is at that moment.
Ruth?
And Byron illustrates a kind of iron law of Washington. We saw it in the wonderful cry, keep your government hands off my Medicare. A benefit once granted, and Obamacare is a benefit in the sense that you have guarantees of certain kinds of coverage, you have subsidies to obtain coverage. Once you give a benefit, it is very, very difficult to take it away from those who are benefiting from that benefit, and that's what Republicans are experiencing right now.
Let's talk about the relief that some people are getting from all of this politics. I know that we have a number of people who don't want to talk about the lighter side, but this has been a really good time for late night comedy. According to the experts who study these things, the fact that TV shows like The Late Show with Stephen Colbert are doing so well follows a long tradition of satire doing well in times of political unrest. At this point, the cast of Saturday Night Live, whose ratings are also through the roof, has spoofed a number of members of the president's cabinet and, of course, the president himself.
Kellyanne, what are people saying about my cabinet appointments? Do they love them?
We have a brand new attorney general, and everyone is very excited about him, and he's going to answer some questions as well as, here we go, yeah, Jeff Sessions!
Elizabeth Warren came at me like a porcupine, but then my friend Mitch McConnell swooped in like an alligator, bite her head off. Whole thing felt like a nature special.
I don't know anything about school, but I do think there should be a school, probably Jesus School, and I do think it should have walls and roof and gun for potential grizzly.
Thank you. Betsy, that's enough for now.
Thank you.
Pootie? Oh my God!
Rexy, baby! Zatira! Zatira!
Send in Steve Bannon.
As a matter of fact, by some accounts, the ratings for The Late Show with Stephen Colbert are up a great deal, possibly because he's found a way to talk about politics in a more bemused way than just kind of shaking your fist at the heavens kind of a way. What do you make of this moment in political satire right now?
I find it notable that the President of the United States of America is routinely shaken by a sketch comedy show that, in my mind at least, hasn't been funny for 10 years. But he does tend to react to Saturday Night Live specifically. There were reports that they were not happy with the fact that the press secretary, Sean Spicer, was played by a woman actor, Melissa McCarthy, who I thought did a pretty good job. I laughed. But this is a moment. Look, the comedy that does well when it sort of stands in opposition to the president. Remember Stephen Colbert's last incarnation, the angry fist-shaking conservative,
the Colbert Report,
right? In opposition to President Obama. So hey, maybe this is. It just seems like a natural evolution.
He was faking opposition to President Obama. I don't think this is actually. I'm not all that amused by what's going on now. I think the Saturday Night Live skit that we just saw, the Fatal Attraction skit about Kellyanne Conway, was absolutely outrageous. And interestingly enough, it's the one that Trump hasn't protested about, has been completely silent about, which indicates to me that maybe he really was mad about it, and the rest of the stuff is show business. But, this is the same show, Saturday Night Live, whose creator famously said it was really hard to find anything funny about Barack Obama. It was like this smooth granite wall. You couldn't find anything to hold on to. And,
which is kind of strange because you had shows like Key and Peele on Comedy Central that found lots of funny things to talk.
But,
I mean, President Obama's anger translator, Luther, that was brilliant comedy about, like, you can't be as cool as everybody thinks you are. You must got an angry black man in you somewhere.
But
so there was comedy to be found.
Yes, but Saturday Night Live has been in large part for a while an in-kind contribution to either the Democratic Party in the race or just the anti-Trump forces. So, I have to say I'm not totally amused by this.
So, first of all, I agree that the Kellyanne Conway Fatal Attraction skit crossed the line. I thought it was sexist and inappropriate. I was disappointed by it. I think the rest of it, whether or not they adequately mined the funniness of Barack Obama's administration, has been very funny. But I think more important, actually, comedy has a weird impact on reality because Saturday Night Live has turned Sean Spicer into a national joke. Probably way more people see their sketch of him than see his actual briefings, and has helped to undermine his credibility, though he's helped some of that himself, I have to say.
I'm Joshua Johnson. You're listening to 1A. Speaking of online content that has caused some outrage, there was another story from the world of the internet with a YouTube star named Felix Kjellberg, better known as PewDiePie. He posts commentaries and narrations of video games on YouTube. If you haven't heard of him, I guarantee your kids or their classmates have heard of him. And he is a big name in YouTube and a big moneymaker. He has billions of views, 53 million YouTube subscribers, and reportedly his work on YouTube earned him $16 million last year. This week, the Wall Street Journal reported that some of PewDiePie's videos contained anti-Semitic content. That prompted the Walt Disney Company, who's begun to invest more on YouTube videos and production studios, to cancel its contract with him. Mr. Kjellberg says all this was taken out of context. He took a few jokes too far, and he says he has condemned the online hate groups that latched onto them. I know that this is not usually something that comes up a lot in Washington, but Byron, what do you think
Well,
of this?
let me start out with a confession here, which is before your producer's email saying what we would be talking about, I'd never heard of PewDiePie, didn't know anything about it, and I'm constantly amazed to find out things that are really, really big that I haven't heard of. But I will say one thing about this. In 2007, during one of the early Republican presidential debates, I was at a small dinner sitting next to the two guys who had created and founded YouTube and had just sold it for $1 zillion to Google. They were the happiest guys in the world. But talking with them about it, it was really fascinating. They were totally fixated on the idea of how do you create a system that allows people to quickly and easily post video on the internet. In other words, how to make it happen. And I was asking him questions about, what kind of limits are there and what the kind of content that people could post. You could post all sorts of completely fake stuff. I could post a video saying I'm Mitt Romney's love child and, it would get zillions of views or something like that. How do you do it? And they really hadn't thought about this kind of thing. And so I think what you see with this anti-Semitic stuff is now that it's become largely corporatized, they're trying to figure out how to deal with objectionable content when that wasn't the idea at all to begin with.
In fact, Facebook put out a very long statement. Mark Zuckerberg, the co-founder and CEO of Facebook, put out what some people called a manifesto. It's almost 6,000 words in which he talks very frankly about the need for social media to be better at dealing with this kind of content. You know, one person's objectionable is another person's risque and otherwise acceptable, and that social media in general, especially as it relates to news content, just has to do a better job of being proactive, of walking that line, and of treating this content the way that real people treat it.
And so I'm a print person talking to a radio person and two other print guys. The power of video is real. The ability to have 53 million followers is huge. And the complications of essentially instant access to video. We saw these debates about Facebook Live and the good part, you know, good in the sense of the woman whose husband or boyfriend was shot by the police was streaming that in real time, her encounter with them. Then we've had these horrible things about live streamed suicides. It's a really complicated video world out there.
And by the way, just by way of context for PewDiePie, I know that I mentioned that he has 53 million subscribers. CNN has fewer than 2 million on YouTube. NPR has 97,000. So
The President of the United States has 25 million followers on Twitter.
There you go.
This guy's got 2 times as many on a platform that I never use.
Texting the kids to see if they've heard of them.
Yeah. Never use it, really?
Well, I mean, I don't know, YouTube channels. This is all new. And to Ruth's point, every single
What's this newfangled stuff?
Right? Yeah. Get off my lawn. To Ruth's point, you know, every media organization in the country is trying to find video. Video is the next big thing. It's the next revenue stream, and none of us have figured it out. And here's a guy who's got 53 million followers.
Just a quick follow on the story we mentioned earlier that the AP is reporting that the Trump administration is considering using as many as 100,000 National Guard troops to round up unauthorized immigrants. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer says the administration has made no effort to do that. He called the report false. I would like to end with one more positive thing. President's Day is this Monday, and if you need a break from the news, you might consider a national park. This Monday, every National Park Service facility will waive their admission fees. This includes the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Carlsbad Caverns, Mount Rainier, and my absolute favorite, Yosemite National Park. The Park Service will have 4 more fee-free days this year, including Veterans Day weekend. Of course, you could just buy an annual pass. It's $80 a year, and an annual pass for seniors, a lifetime pass for seniors, is $10. Every national park in the country for just $10. If that's not a good news story to end the Friday News Roundup, I don't know what is. Byron York is the chief political correspondent for the Washington Examiner. Byron, thanks for spending the hour with us.
Thank you for having me.
Ruth Marcus for the Washington Post, deputy editorial page editor and columnist. Thank you, Ruth.
Thanks.
And Reed Wilson, national correspondent for The Hill. Reed, appreciate you being with us.
Interior Department Instagram is an awesome Instagram account to follow.
Remember to keep your feedback coming on the stories you hear on 1A, 855-236-1A1A, or email 1A@WAMU.org. 1A comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Joshua Johnson. Thank you so much for listening. This is 1A.
you for having me.
Christian Carl is the editor.
Since President Trump has no mention of it at all in Russian state TV, right? The Russians were completely silent on it. There's this sense that there's complete bewilderment in Moscow. And there have been a bunch of great articles in the past few days about how the Russian love affair with Trump is starting to cool because they've kind of figured out that he's a little bit unpredictable and erratic. And even if he might say some nice things about them and do some things that they like, they like people who are predictable. They don't like being surprised all the time. And right now in the media in Russia, there is some interesting graffiti in Moscow recently that we probably don't need to go into, criticizing Trump. It was a big deal. It's very interesting. The whole mood about Trump and Russia has kind of shifted. And the Flynn scandal is apparently too hot for them to handle. They just can't even deal with it at the moment.
That's Christian Karl of the Washington Post with us for the global edition of the Friday News Roundup, alongside Yagana Torbati of Reuters and Courtney Cubie of NBC News. And with you, what questions and thoughts do you have about the week's top international stories? Email us 1a@wamu.org, comment on our Facebook page, or tweet us at 1a. Let's talk a little further about Russia. The Russians deployed a missile in apparent violation of a treaty. A Russian spy ship moved closer to the east coast of the U.S., so I believe it's still in international waters. What does this mean? Is this a test of the Trump administration? Is this significant? Are they just kind of hanging around in the ways that these ships typically do, and we don't talk about it because we don't talk about Russia this way much? What does this mean? You got it?
So several of these moves are in keeping with the same sorts of things that Russia was doing during the Obama administration and during the George W. Bush administration. They're fairly consistent. They're, sailing of this submarine fairly close to the U.S. East Coast is, something that they've done before. It's not unprecedented. We've seen news reports from those towns, and it's, they say it's something that they're quite used to, and it's not something that they've never seen before. And with this missile, that is more worrisome for U.S. military officials and military planners. The New York Times reported that this violates a longstanding treaty that the U.S. and Russia have had since 1987. Russia denies that it violates a treaty, and they say that they haven't been accused officially of violating any such treaty. And so, they're taking a different stance. But the deployment of that missile, which is sort of a cruise missile that is sort of seen as being, kind of a bit more provocative, military officials said, prior to this happening, that if that were to happen, the U.S. should show some sort of response, whether it's moving more missile defenses into Europe or taking some sort of stronger response to show Russia that there is a line here. Now, it's unclear if the Trump administration is going to do that.
So this cruise missile is absolutely worrisome, and I completely agree. They have a sea-based variant of this that they've already been using, that they launched from the sea, and they've actually used it in Syria recently. So, and it's a capability they've been testing for some time. The U.S. knew that they had it. What's sort of new this week is that the Russians are calling it a deployment. It's actually still in Russia, but they've operationalized it, is how the U.S. military would term it. So that means they've assigned it to a unit that it could be deployed from.
Just ready to go, basically.
Precisely, exactly. So, and that is certainly worrisome. Cruise missiles, obviously, they fly low, they fly fast, they can turn. It's a serious concern, but it's also a capability that the U.S. really knew that Russia had. And the ship, just as June was saying, is they frequently have these kinds of ships off the coast. They always stay in international waters in these past deployments. And what's funny is, President Trump at his news conference yesterday said, "Oh, it would be so great. Everyone would be so happy if I just blew this thing out of the water." Well, and
would everybody really be happy with that?
He didn't qualify who everybody was.
Yeah.
But what's somewhat ironic about that is that the U.S. has ships that are off Russia's coast right now that are doing the exact same thing, that have far greater capabilities, frankly, as far as espionage. And in fact, one of them was one of the ones that a couple of Russian jets just buzzed recently. It was a U.S. ship that was about 40 miles off the Russian coast, and the Russians flew a couple of jets nearby, not in a really unsafe distance, but close enough to get their attention. So it's ironic that this, after the U.S. is doing the exact same thing in Russia, President Trump comes out and condemns it so.
There's a lot more to talk about in this hour of the Friday News Roundup with Courtney Cubie of NBC News, Christian Karl of The Washington Post, and Yagana Torbati of Reuters. I'm Joshua Johnson. Glad to be with you. You're listening to 1A from WAMU and NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Progressive Insurance, with insurance for cars, home, boat, motorcycles, RVs, and commercial vehicles at 1-800-PROGRESSIVE and Progressive.com. From the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, dedicated to the belief that all lives have equal value, and working with partners to help envision a world where every person has the opportunity to live a healthy, productive life at gatesfoundation.org. And from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation at macfound.org.
This is 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson. It's the global edition of the Friday News Roundup. You might remember recently we asked you to tell us what stories you thought we should talk about, especially if it helps us all take a break from politics and the troubles of the world. We've been talking a lot about what's been going on around the world, and we will continue to do that this Friday. But what if we thought a little bigger?
This is Nathan calling from Pennsylvania. Today you asked for a non-political suggestion for discussion on Friday's show. Well, I'd like to know more about Jupiter's moon, Europa. In September 2016, NASA announced that it had detected plumes of water erupting from the moon's icy surface using the Hubble Space Telescope. Could there be life in the ocean beneath Europa's crust? I'd love to hear you talk space.
And we will talk space, Nathan. He listens to us on WHYY in Philadelphia, which just started airing 1A this week. Thank you for the question. Thank you for listening. We are working on a show about spaceflight, and I have a space story for you today later on. But for now, let's keep our feet on the ground with our panel here in studio: Courtney Cuby of NBC News, Christian Karl of The Washington Post, and Yagana Torbati of Reuters. We welcome more of your questions and thoughts on the week's international news. Tweet us at 1A, comment on our Facebook page, or email 1A@WAMU.org. Let's talk about Israel. President Trump hosted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House this week. During a joint press conference, Mr. Trump had this to say about the prospect of a two-state solution in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process.
So I'm looking at two-state and one-state, and I like the one that both parties like. I'm very happy with the one that both parties like. I can live with either one. I thought for a while the two-state looked like it may be the easier of the two. But honestly, if Bibi and if the Palestinians, if Israel and the Palestinians are happy, I'm happy with the one they like the best.
Now, that's a big shift. Mr. Trump basically kind of reversed decades of U.S. foreign policy centered on the creation of a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, the so-called two-state solution. What does this mean? Is this just talk, or is this a real, meaningful policy shift? Yana?
It's very hard to tell at this point. Just a day or two later, Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, came out and said that the U.S. still absolutely supports a two-state solution. So it's hard to know at this point how to interpret whether Mr. Trump's words, President Trump's words, is that a significant shift, or is it sort of in the moment that's what he said? It's hard to know at this point. Prime Minister Netanyahu coming here, visiting with President Trump for their first visit since he became president, his stances present some difficulties for Prime Minister Netanyahu, who, President Trump's pick for ambassador to Israel has taken positions to the right of Prime Minister Netanyahu on issues like settlements, and that puts more pressure on Netanyahu within Israel to support the settler movement. So it actually complicates the prospects for a solution. It's hard to see how the Palestinians would take the U.S. position seriously. So we don't quite know yet whether this is a significant shift or if it's just a rhetorical statement by him that will be backed down on.
I wonder what your assessment is of how much this actually affects policy on the ground. I mean, you have said that you're right about your assessment about President Trump's policy on Israel. There's also been talk of moving the U.S. Embassy out of Tel Aviv to the more religiously fraught, meaningful city of Jerusalem, which is touchy for a wide array of reasons. How much does all of this talk actually affect things on the ground on a day-to-day level? Courtney?
Well, if you want to talk about the embassy, there's a history of candidates saying that they're going to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, and it doesn't happen. Going back to President Clinton, I believe, and George W. Bush, there was a law passed, I think, in 1995 by Congress that said that the U.S. embassy had to move to Jerusalem by 1999, but it had a clause in it that said if the president is concerned about national security concerns, then he can write a waiver for 6 months. Well, ever since then, every 6 months, the president has done that, including President Obama, who just did it in December. So if we really want to know what President Trump is going to do with the embassy, he's going to have to make a decision by May because the 6 months will be up. But as far as, this press conference with Netanyahu and President Trump this week, he also, I think, really surprised him when he looked at him. There were two moments when he looked at him and said something very conversationally. One of them was, it'd be great if you would hold back on settlements for a while. And that seemed to throw Netanyahu on his heels a little bit, where he said, well, I guess we'll see. And then President Trump said, well, that doesn't sound very optimistic. I mean, it was a very odd, most of these are pretty planned out in advance. And part of this may be the fact that in another unusual step, they actually held their press conference prior to meeting, where usually there's the meeting between the leaders and then they come out and talk to the press afterwards about what they just met with. But instead, they came out cold.
Now, in that press conference, though, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as you said, he was kind of put back on his heels, but he also tried to put forth a very strong face in terms of Israel's relationship with the U.S.
I've known the president and I've known his family and his team for a long time. And there is no greater supporter of the Jewish people and the Jewish state than President Donald Trump. I think we should put that to rest.
Now, it was very clear in the end of the Obama administration that Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Obama were not friends. It was very clear that the relationship is adversarial. Could this begin to shake that, especially as it relates to this issue of settlements? Yagana?
It's true that Netanyahu and Obama, it was clear that they did not get along, although that alliance between the U.S. and Israel, has been in place for decades. And, the U.S. just approved a huge military aid package to Israel. So that's not in danger. You almost kind of wonder, would Prime Minister Netanyahu prefer a more traditional conservative Republican as opposed to President Trump, who is unpredictable in some of his statements and does seem to have advisors around him that are advancing contradictory notions. And the clip that you just played there was really Prime Minister Netanyahu doing President Trump a huge favor. It was in response kind of indirectly to a previous question he had received about, views not of President Trump, but of maybe people around him that might be anti-Semitic.
Christian?
There's one aspect I would just like to mention, which is, we keep talking about this as if the United States and Israel were the only players in this whole thing. And of course, the two-state solution is something that is very, very strongly accepted by the European Union. It's the subject, if I'm not mistaken, maybe my colleagues will correct me, but it is the foundation for the Mideast Quartet talks on peace in the Middle East. The UN supports it. Governments around the world support it. So that's an important dimension, I think, that sometimes gets lost because President Trump has a tendency to talk about bilateral things. He doesn't really trust multilateral arrangements where lots of countries are cooperating on something. But that's actually a very important aspect people shouldn't forget. He's not entirely, he can't call all the shots by himself.
And the talk of new Israeli settlements, that has been moving in the last few weeks. There have been, 5,000 more settlements?
Yeah, nearly 6,000 settlements since President Trump took office. And there hasn't been a peep about it out of the White House, which of course has pleased, Netanyahu and pleased his, the right-wing members of his party. I mean, as did, frankly, the fact that President Trump came out and was sort of wishy-washy on the two-state solution. That really pleased the more hardline members of Netanyahu's party back in Israel. There was also another, unusual and kind of candid moment between them when President Trump said that if there's going to be a compromise, both sides are going to have to make compromises. And he looked at Netanyahu and said, "You know that, right?" And I mean, it was just remarkable to watch. We've covered these bilats, and they are usually so canned. You don't generally see that kind of candor and surprise on either party.
But we can't really be surprised with President Trump because he's made it clear that he wants to shake up the way things are done in Washington.
This is obvious the way he will negotiate things that diplomatic relations have a very different meaning for President Trump. It is more, as Netanyahu said, it is more of the art of the deal way of dealing with things, as opposed to the diplomatic with the canned language and the that we're accustomed to seeing here.
But that might, I wonder if that might be one of those areas in which, ideals collide with reality in terms of the way the rest of the world does business. And not everyone thinks to run the government like a business, or at least like a Trump organization business, especially, and I don't know what's going to happen, but especially with something as fraught as the two-state solution. That might be one of those where you just kind of have to learn the rules and try to bend them rather than break them.
I mean, we're seeing example after example of this. When President Trump spoke with the Taiwanese leader by phone, that really rankled China. And we saw just a few days ago, he affirmed to the leader of China, Xi Jinping, that he would be he supports the one China policy.
Now, let's remind people what that involved. You're talking about after President-elect Trump won the election, speaking to the head of state of Taiwan, which breaks a long-held U.S. foreign policy norm known as the one China solution that says that the Chinese central government is the government and that U.S. diplomatic relations run through the Chinese central government and not through Taiwan.
Exactly. And so this really bothered China, and they wanted basically a reversal of that, or at least an outright recognition of the one China policy, which has been a mainstay of U.S. foreign policy for years, for decades. And we saw in the phone call that happened about a week ago that President Trump kind of retreated back to that traditional foreign policy line. And also we saw in the confirmation hearings for his pick for ambassador to Israel, under pretty harsh questioning, he basically said that he believes the two-state solution is the best chance for peace. And so you're seeing the administration that's taking shape around President Trump hewing to the traditional foreign policy lines in contradiction to what he said at that press conference. So it's very hard from our position right now to assess where this is all going to lead and how it actually plays out.
I'm Joshua Johnson. You're listening to 1A. Since you mentioned China, a listener gave us a question related to the president and China. Daniel emailed us. President Trump was awarded a court victory regarding a trademark of his name in China following his recent conversation with President Xi Jinping. Is this a violation of the Emoluments Clause? Now, by way of context, Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution states that the president cannot receive foreign titles or benefits from another government, otherwise known as an emolument, or profits from another government, without the permission of Congress. This came up today during an interview that Steve Inskeep and Congressman Elijah Cummings had on NPR's Morning Edition, whether or not this might be a violation of the Emoluments Clause. I don't know if any of you are foreign trademark experts, but a number of our listeners have been asking about this. Yagana?
So I will leave it to the constitutional lawyers to decide if this actually did violate the Emoluments Clause. What I will say is that this is the exact issue that many people warned would start coming up over and over in President Trump's presidency, that even foreign policy positions that he may take totally legitimately and after arriving at the issue with a lot of consideration and thought will be called into question because of his business activities abroad. Many of the warnings that people gave about his possible conflicts of interest were really for his own sake, so that people in the media, the American people, do not doubt what might even be legitimately taken positions that are really in the best interest of the United States.
Let's shift gears to North Korea, a rather wild and tragic episode regarding the regime. This week it was reported that Kim Jong-nam, who is the half-brother of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, was assassinated in broad daylight at the airport in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The South Korea spy chief has asserted that the assassination order came directly from the North Korean capital. That's South Korea's assertion. If it's true, this wouldn't be the first time that someone who's fallen out of favor with Kim Jong-un has been targeted in either a purge or an outright execution. Last year, candidate Donald Trump talked about North Korea on CBS This Morning with Norah O'Donnell.
Yesterday, we heard the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, at Congress saying that North Korea's nuclear effort is the top threat to the United States. What would you do to deal with that reclusive country?
I would get China to make that guy disappear in one form or another very quickly. And let me tell you, people say,
how do you make him disappear and assassinate him?
Let me just tell you, no, well, I've heard of worse things, frankly. I mean, this guy's a bad dude, and don't underestimate him. Any young guy can take over from his father with all those generals and everybody else that probably want the position. This is not somebody to be underestimated.
But why
China has control.
I'll
tell you why. Because China has control absolute control of North Korea. They don't say it, but they do. And they should make that problem disappear. China is sucking us dry. They're taking our money. They're taking our jobs. They're doing so much. We have rebuilt China with what they've taken out. We have power over China. China should do that.
That was Donald Trump speaking as a candidate last year on CBS This Morning. What do we make of this assassination attempt as it relates to the political climate in North Korea right now, and not only the United States, but really the world's response to North Korea?
Well, the assumption has been that this half-brother would be, if China were to have its way, they've been sort of harboring him for some time, he would eventually maybe take over for his brother and go in and install what would be a quote-unquote friendlier regime to the Chinese. Someone who, I have to admit, I'd never heard those comments from Donald Trump before. Someone who actually might have a little bit more influence over the regime than China really does right now. They can do things, they could impose some sanctions, they could withhold some material goods, they could provide some diplomatic pressure, but Pyongyang has really shown an ability to withstand that pressure from China and not fold to it. So, but if there was someone who was friendlier in there in the regime, perhaps China would have more authority. So, this is really a black eye to China. The fact that he was assassinated, it didn't happen in Macau, which is where he generally lives. It happened in Malaysia. I think it would have been an even bigger black eye to China, and it would have been a much even more difficult and convoluted diplomatic incident if it had been in China rather than Malaysia. But it's a black eye to China because it was a sign that North Korea, the regime, can reach in to this person who, might have been the future. He talked about modernization. He talked about bringing North Korea more into the world stage. It's a sign that North Korea can actually reach in and stop that.
Well, first, a very quick remark about what President Trump said there about putting pressure on China to take out Kim Jong-un. The fact of the matter is that the United States has been pressuring China for decades now to moderate the situation in North Korea. And as we were just saying, that the North Korea has shown an immense ability to resist Chinese pressure. China does have a very strong interest in keeping the regime alive in North Korea, because if that regime were to collapse, the Chinese are very afraid that Korea would become unified under the South Korean government and American troops would move all the way up to the Chinese border. That's the last thing the Chinese want. So even as aggravating as the North Korean leaders have been, China really doesn't have a direct and immediate interest in intervening there and changing the regime. About the assassination, I also subscribe to the theory that that Kim Jong-un wanted to get rid of his half-brother because he represented a possible successor. What fascinates me is just the amazing viciousness of this guy. I mean, even by the standards of the North Korean regime, this guy is uniquely psychopathic. He killed his uncle, who was a very powerful figure when Kim Jong-un took power. He had him arrested in a live party meeting. They dragged him out of the meeting. Then he made his uncle watch as two of his uncle's associates were shot to death with anti-aircraft fire. And then the same thing was done to the uncle. I mean, it's really boggles the mind.
We'll continue the conversation on the other side of this break with Christian Carl of The Washington Post, Yagana Torbati of Reuters, Courtney Cubie of NBC News, and with you. Send us more of your questions and thoughts about the week's international news, 1a@wamu.org. Stay close.
Rorschach's famous ink blots.
A lot of people do dismiss them.
But writer Damien Searle says those dismissals are out of date. The Rorschach test works.
The real test is not that if you see a bouncing bunny, you're the good twin, and if you see an axe murderer, you're the bad twin.
I'm Robert Siegel. Herman Rorschach's symmetrical blobs and where they came from. This afternoon on All Things Considered from NPR News.
And from Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and the advancement of international peace and security. More information is available online at carnegie.org. From the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, working to improve the quality of people's lives by supporting the performing arts, the environment, medical research, and child well-being. Information is available at ddcf.org. And from the listeners who support this NPR station.
Before we get back to our conversation, a quick reminder that we would love your suggestions for whatever you would like us to talk about on upcoming episodes of 1A. What's a topic you think everyone should be talking about? We've had some very interesting suggestions so far. Jerome in North Carolina asked, sports are so diverse, but when writers, coaches, or athletes express their opinions, there's often backlash. Should politics stay out of sports? Betsy in Ohio suggested, is vocational education evolving to meet market demands? And another listener in Virginia asked us to explore the burgeoning tsunami called virtual reality. Interesting ideas. We'd like to hear yours. Go to our website, the1a.org, and click the tab that says Ask 1A. Again, that's the word the number 1, the letter A.org. Leave us a voicemail, 855-236-1A1A. That's 855-236-1212. You could also make a voice memo with your smartphone and email it to 1a@wamu.org. Your idea might end up as a future segment here on 1A. Back now to the global edition of the Friday News Roundup with Christian Carl of The Washington Post, Yagana Torbati of Reuters, and Courtney Cubie of NBC News. We welcome more of your questions and thoughts about the week's top international stories, 1a@wamu.org. Tweet us at 1a or comment on our Facebook page. Let's talk about NATO and Europe. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis has put NATO allies on notice. During a private meeting with defense ministers this week in Brussels, Mattis said that if countries do not increase their defense spending in line with NATO guidelines of 2% of your GDP per year, the United States may have to, in his words, moderate its commitment to the alliance. What might that mean? What do we mean by moderate the commitment? Courtney?
He was specifically asked that, and he said he wouldn't elaborate on it. So we actually don't know what it means. It's not the first time that we've had a defense secretary or even the president of the United States go to a NATO meeting and call for the other members to meet their fiduciary requirements under NATO. Secretary Gates in 2011 gave a very famous speech where he said, talked about the dismal future of NATO and the climate back home, that the U.S. Congress was no longer going to continue to pay for this unless others started to meet their requirements. But this was the first time that we heard something that sounded sort of like an ultimatum, to moderate requirements. We just don't know exactly what that's going to mean. He also talked again, that was at NATO in Brussels, what you were just talking about. He also was in Munich today where he repeated that again. He called on NATO members to meet the NATO allies to meet their proportionate share. And then he also talked about the concern about the arc of instability bordering Europe, which is another thing they didn't exactly elaborate on what he meant on that. What's interesting here, though, is, throughout the campaign, we heard Donald Trump talk about NATO and warn that, maybe the U.S. might be diminishing their commitment or might not meet the commitments of Article 5 or whatever. And this week, what we've seen is, once again, members of his cabinet with a very different message. We saw Secretary Mattis, we saw Secretary Tillerson, and now we're about to see Vice President Pence, who's about to head to Munich as well. And senior administration officials briefed before he left and said that he's going to go and talk about the strong commitment that the U.S. has to NATO. So it's interesting. Once again, we have President Trump saying one thing and then all of his trusted advisors and colleagues saying something completely different on the world stage.
And Article 5 is that NATO requirement that all NATO allies have to basically come defend one another. It's this idea that an attack on one is an attack on all.
Exactly. It's actually, it's somewhat misunderstood because it actually, if you read it, it says an attack on one is an attack on all, and all members have the right to decide whether they want to respond. It's not actually a 100% commitment. If you're in NATO, you have to respond. So that's one area where you could think maybe the U.S. would moderate. Maybe they would sort of change how they would see an attack on one and whether it was something that the U.S. would respond to. But I mean, candidly, that's completely speculative because we just don't know what Mattis meant.
Yagana?
And ironically, the only time Article 5 has actually been invoked was to defend the United States after 9/11, when NATO countries sent forces to Afghanistan and, provided other support to help protect the United States. One thing I wanted to mention was the reaction from, Eastern European defense ministers and diplomats was not really, outrage or a lot of worry. It seemed like they really saw this coming, and they appreciated Defense Secretary Mattis's tone when he delivered that message. I think one described him as being humble, and the language that he used was very clear. There was no kind of ambiguity about what he was saying, but he said it, in a way that was like, look, with the political realities that I face and we face in the United States, this is what I can tell you, and I owe it to you to tell you that. I think that was appreciated by, the ministers there.
So they didn't think he was chest thumping, in other words.
No, and it was really just an acknowledgement of the reality that he finds himself in and that the United States finds itself in with the current political climate.
And where does this stand right now? Is anyone else raising these concerns as loudly as the United States is, or is this mostly just coming from the U.S.?
It's the U.S. that commits the most compared to its GDP to defense issues. So it's the one that is carrying the biggest burden. There are several countries that have met that 2% threshold, and others that are right up there. I think Latvia is at like 1.6, 1.7% is about to hit 2% next year. So the U.S. is the one that is most concerned about this. But Eastern European countries have done perhaps their share, maybe more than their share, to also meet that burden.
Well, there is a great deal going on in Europe right now, including in Romania. There have been huge protests there for basically the last 2 weeks. It's a political showdown that started over the Romanian cabinet's effort to weaken anti-corruption laws. Romania's government withdrew this decree to legalize some forms of official misconduct. That happened after hundreds of thousands of people protested in cities all around Romania. It was basically the biggest display of popular anger since communism fell in 1989. The government survived a no-confidence vote last week in Parliament, where it has a solid majority. How concerning is this? Is this a concern to the European Union more broadly, to the United States specifically, to the international community, this instability in Romania? Christian?
Well, I think there's some concern, but I think it's also actually a very positive development. And I think the EU sees it very much in that context, the European Union. Precisely because you mentioned the fall of communism in Romania in 1989. Well, basically, ever since then, the same people have been running Romania. The parties change, the faces change, but it's basically the same people, many of them connected with the old communist elite. And somehow it's never really been possible to drive these people out of power. So corruption has been a constant drumbeat in Romania for the past 25 years. And there's huge popular discontent over it. And there have been very, very big protests before, particularly about a dicey gold mine deal where people's land was taken away. There's a history of this in Romania. But to make a long story short, the fact that hundreds of thousands of people are demonstrating this way is a very positive development, because really what they're demonstrating for is real democracy. It's not just corruption. It's a popular protest for to get rid of this old corrupt elite and really find new people to run the country.
Yagana?
And I mean, one thing that's notable is it's like 20 degrees Fahrenheit right now in Romania, and people are going out in ski suits and braving the cold in huge numbers to lodge these protests. And as happens with many protest movements, it starts with the germ of something. Most notably, the initial spark here was this corruption measure. And it has kind of grown so that the complaints and the concerns that they're voicing are far greater. They want better schools, better roads, better hospitals. They just want a better country. And it's still to be seen whether there's anything that this new government can do to appease those concerns.
Put this in context in terms of some of the other populist movements that are sweeping Europe right now. There's been a real concern with certain far-right leaders like Marine Le Pen in France, candidates, I should say, Marine Le Pen in France, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, the Five Star Party in Italy, that there's this wave of what we in the U.S. might call right-wing populism that has a lot of people concerned. Is this that, or is this something else? Is this another kind of populist movement?
This is more a reflection of a younger generation that's sick of seeing corruption and that's fighting back against what they see as an older, corrupt generation of politicians that they want out. It's one of the things that makes this different. I mean, there's a history of protests leading to political upheaval in Romania. Nicolae Ceausescu, Victor Ponta. So it's not new in Romania. What's new about this one, though, is that these are younger, tech-savvy people. They're organizing online, and they are not, even when they had a couple of the ministers resign in the past several days, and when they overturned this new decree, they're still out there. They're still out there in a lot of numbers because they're saying, no, we're not going to be satisfied with you throwing us a justice minister as someone that's not going to isn't going to really have an impact on this. We want real change. And so what's different about this one specifically is the youth, and it seems like they have some staying power. Like Yagana was saying, they're out there in the freezing cold. They're coming after work every single night, hundreds of thousands at some points.
And what's notable is, the elections that brought this party to power were kind of marked by this feeling of apathy. There was lower turnout, and that seems to have just been swept aside. People are much more engaged now that they've seen the first moves of this government.
And we should also note that the U.S. has an interest in Romania. I believe there are a few hundred new troops that have been moved there to help bolster defense there. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, they also have some anti-aircraft. I'm sorry, some anti-missile, batteries there as well.
I'm Joshua Johnson. You're listening to 1A. Let's see if we can hit a few more things going on in Europe and about Europe before the hour is up. There have been also a number of riots in Paris, in the suburbs of Paris, for the last 2 weeks, as protesters take to the streets basically every night to protest police brutality there. The demonstrations began after a video of a young black man was being assaulted surfaced online, being assaulted by the police. At times, the riots have turned violent, and of course, the calls for justice are just getting louder as this story continues to spread. How has the Parisian government and the French government responded to all this?
The French government has sought to, tamp down the protests by showing that it's very sympathetic to the protesters' cause. Francois Hollande, the leader of France, visited the victim in the hospital. And on television, on camera, the victim said, look, please don't, destroy things. Please don't riot. I believe one of his relatives also issued that plea as well. Of course, Marine Le Pen, the right-wing candidate for France's elections that are due to take place in 3 months or so, has also seized on this issue and she enjoys a lot of support from French police. And so she's using it to show that the government doesn't support its police and is kind of stoking maybe. And there's also the element of race here. Those kind of suburbs north of Paris, they're, more black and brown. There's Middle Eastern immigrants as well as black Parisians there and black French people. And so therefore that's sort of part of all this as well.
So this is kind of speaking to larger underlying tensions that have kind of boiled over in a lot of parts of France.
I think that's definitely an undertone that's going on here.
And this has the potential to affect the presidential election, which is coming up in a few months?
I think if the way Marine Le Pen probably sees it is that if she can make people feel unsafe, or that the police are being attacked, or that rioters are going unchecked, that plays into the issues that she is comfortable, and that is where she's comfortable.
Let's hit on a few more audience comments before our hour is up. Trevor tweeted us, Trump's comments didn't say anything to convince me, this is regarding Israel. Trump's comments didn't say anything to convince me that it wasn't just bluster, or that he even knows what the two-state solution means. Are people convinced that this president is really plugged into what's going on and savvy and ready to deal with this?
Well, so by saying, what's fascinating is that a lot of people think that he came out and overturned, decades of U.S. policy. But what he really did was say, look, I don't care. As long as there's peace, I don't care what it looks like. I don't care if it's one state or it's a two-state. It was a shockingly cavalier attitude to take about peace in the Middle East that's been so elusive for decades.
Like whatever works.
Yeah, whatever works. Yeah. So Trevor's right about that. I was also a little bit surprised that senior administration officials came out afterwards and openly acknowledged it. They said, he doesn't really care what peace looks like as long as it comes. What it doesn't recognize, though, is that it's hard to envision a scenario where the Palestinians would accept any kind of a negotiated settlement that doesn't involve a sovereign nation for them, a sovereign state. So it sort of looks as if he doesn't necessarily understand that the implications of saying that the U.S. doesn't support a two-state solution would potentially drive the Palestinians away from what is already a negotiating table that's been empty for some time.
Brian tweeted us, "It seems odd that the owner of a major league or other professional sports team would be floated as a potential ambassador to France. The connection to the Kushner family interest in purchasing the Florida Marlins is hard to escape. Is this a violation of law or ethics?" Now, by way of context, the owner of the Miami Marlins is the White House's choice, reportedly, to be the U.S. ambassador to France. According to the New York Post, Jeffrey Loria was handpicked by White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus. Loria is an art dealer who bought the franchise back in 2003. Is he qualified for this? Is this something he wants to do? Like, what do we make of this?
So, as I think you're a former South Florida resident, so you probably know more about Jeffrey Loria. I understand he's not very popular in that part of the state. This is actually the second major sports owner that's been possibly floated or named as an ambassador to a major European country by the Trump administration. The first one being Woody Johnson, who owns the New York Jets. It's not unheard of for major donors to a campaign to be rewarded with quite plum assignments. President Obama did this to much criticism. Presidents do this. This is sort of their way of, especially if it's seen as a country that's not vital. The French ambassadorship and the British ambassadorship, those are quite important posts, and those are very important allies that the U.S. has. And so that might come under more question.
Well, we have gone around the world this hour, and as promised to our new listener in Pennsylvania, we're going to head to space at this point to end the program on something of a truly global nature. Tomorrow, what had been a historic launch pad at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida gets back in business with a resupply trip to the International Space Station. Launch Complex 39A went idle 6 years ago when NASA ended the shuttle program. The commercial shuttle company SpaceX will use that pad to send a cargo rocket to the International Space Station. The cargo includes equipment to more accurately measure the Earth's atmosphere, an experiment to see if antibodies can be grown more effectively in space, and a test system for self-driving spacecraft. Liftoff is scheduled for 10:01 Eastern Time. And that'll do it for the Friday News Roundup. My thanks to Courtney Cubey, national security producer for NBC News. Courtney, thank you for spending the hour with us.
Thank you very much.
Christian Carl is the editor of Democracy Post at The Washington Post. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you.
And Yagana Torbati covers foreign policy for Reuters. Yagana, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Remember, you can subscribe to 1A's podcast on iTunes or whatever app you prefer. We would love it if you'd write us a review. You'll find even more great podcasts online at npr.org/podcasts. And remember, we welcome your suggestions for future topics we should consider for the program. 855-236-1A1A. 1A comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for listening. Enjoy your weekend. This is 1A.